All right, tonight we are going to hear from not the volume editor, as you know, but the signature books editor, John Hatch, who worked on 13th Apostle. John is, how long have you been there, John, at Signature now?
4 years.
4 years. Used to work for another book company, which I did as well, Deseret Book Company. He is the editor of Danish Apostle, the Diaries of Anton H. Lund, not Anthon, which is now out of print. And I hate to tell you, but I don't think any copies are available for sale because of that fact. But you could get on a waiting list, and eventually we would find you a copy. We have now found a copy after a request of 27 years. Somebody asked us for an out-of-print book 27 years ago, and we found it in the last year. But usually we get them a lot quicker than that. We will also hear from David Busath, who is a professor at Brigham Young University, teaches anatomy and physiology, has an MD from the University of Utah, taught for a number of years at Brown University, and is the president of the Amasa M Lyman Educational and Historical Society. I knew I wouldn't be able to remember it, so I had to look at it. And so, we've kind of put him into a little bit of an awkward position. He didn't do the book, but he knows a lot about Amasa Lyman and the family, and so we're excited to hear from these two gentlemen. And then during the Q&A, we also have Brad Partridge, Scott's son, here with us tonight. And he has agreed to answer questions if you have any that he might be able to help with when we do the Q&A. And like I said, we'll just have to kind of see how this signing part goes. So whoever you want to sign it, you can have them sign it. But we're going to just proceed on that basis. And again, we're very grateful that you've come tonight. John, are you going first, or?
Sure.
So John Hatch then will talk to us about the book, and then about 6:45 or so, we'll take Q&A and go from there. It's 20,000 volts. All right, let's see how that goes.
Seems fair.
You,
Anything?
let's try this.
All right. Got it?
Can you hear back there?
I can just yell.
Well, something happened. Well, but it switched over to on. Christopher?
Hold it up and see if it works. Look the mic.
Yeah, I did. I think the battery's dead.
Is the light on?
Nope. Technical difficulties. Do you want to just yell for a while until we
Just scream into the void.
You know, like, pretend you're at home.
Yeah. If the video pick up, I can just talk loud. But
Oh, well, will that pick that up okay?
Shows it's on.
Hang on just 1 second.
Now that's a joke.
no. I'll just say whatever pops into my head, and nobody wants that.
No, Trump already did that.
Right. Yeah, I can't top that.
You don't want Well, sorry, we're gonna try a new battery and see if that works. I've got lots of jokes, but you don't want to hear them. Oh, there we go. Very good. Thank you, sir.
Something.
Wow.
Now you can either, you want to put this in your pocket or just down here? Let's try this and see how that works.
All right, there we go. Okay, I was fortunate enough to work with Scott Partridge for a few months, and it was really great. He assembled this. It was quite a feat, and it goes over this period of time that reflects changes in how the church has approached its history. He got permission as a descendant to go to church archives and look at microfilm, but the diaries were still restricted. He wasn't allowed to see everything up until that point, but he transcribed what he could, and then sometimes they would let him take a microfilm with him, and he would transcribe that. And then they would let him sometimes see the originals, and he would transcribe that. And it was very back and forth like that. And then the diaries showed up scanned and available, mostly on the Selected Collections DVDs, and now they're online. But the diaries, in addition to that, they're hard enough for Scott to have put together, because Amasa would write, he would sit down, say, on his mission in July 1844, and would write something, and then get interrupted, and then he'd be at home in Fillmore in 1872 and want to write something, so he'd pick up that same diary and turn to that same page and maybe skip a couple of lines and start writing again. And it was something else to hunt everything down and put it into chronological order, and Scott did all of that and found some really terrific stuff. When I first started emailing Scott, I sent him chapter 1, and he wrote back right away and said, "This looks great, thank you." And it's that feeling that editors know, where on the one hand you're like, well, good, this guy's not going to give me a hard time. But on the other hand, you're like, I hope he's checking my work. And then I sent him chapter 2, and he was checking my work. He was very engaged. He had a lot of corrections and said, well, I actually have this transcript, and you put this. So he was very good. And I was very fortunate to work with him. I want to talk a little bit differently. I'm not going to read from the book. I want to talk about why primary sources are important. It's because for me they illuminate this world and the past in ways that maybe we don't appreciate. And I want to talk about that. The beauty of primary sources is the infinite rabbit holes they spawn. A few words in a diary and we're off, twisting and turning as we burrow through the rich soil of the past. It's easy to look at the shelves around us and think that there are no more stories to tell. There's plenty of books here. The lives of Joseph Smith and Brigham Young and dozens of other familiar names have maybe grown just a little bit crusty and stale. We've heard all the same stories. But then we crack open the diaries of this brilliant New Hampshire native turned Mormon, and we're off once more, racing backward through time. Amasa Lyman, for example, mentions a steamboat he traveled on, and we learn that on the same steamboat, a young Samuel Clemens helped navigate. He mentions another ship, and we learn that this one burned. It might still be rotting in the bottom of New York Harbor today. He writes the name of a southern town he passes through where a man railed against John Quincy Adams for his abolitionism, and where a stranger kept them up half the night as he moaned in pain. After they finally fell asleep, they were quickly awakened again by yelling outside. Some drunken men thought it would be a delightful jape to string a rope across the road about a foot off the ground and yell while a theater performance was going on, and then laugh uproariously while dozens of people streamed outside, and they all tripped over the rope and fell on top of one another. He wrote the name of a woman who was coerced and tricked into sex with a married man who promised to take her as a polygamous wife, then reversed himself after he got what he wanted. He wrote the names of countless of poor, faithful Latter-day Saints he met in Europe, where he was surprised by the crippling want and said, "Poverty encircles heaven's brightest gems." He seemed to deeply care for these people. But he also had his limits. After an experiment to ride in the cheapest fare available train car, he vowed to never do it again and wrote vividly of the stench. He wrote the names of strangers, of friends, of family, of his co-religionists, each who lived their own lives and wandered through the world like the rest of us, trying to juggle our own existence. And so with that in mind, I want to talk about 3 names that he wrote in the diaries tonight. The first is Lizzie Flake Rowan. She was a slave given to James M. and Agnes Flake as a wedding present when she was 4 years old, though there was some confusion about when she was born. She was taken to San Bernardino, California, the Mormon colony founded by Amasa and Charles C. Rich. She was owned by Agnes after James died in 1850 when he was thrown from his mule. Technically, she should have been freed the moment she set foot in California. It was a free state, and there were laws stipulating that once a slave was brought into the state, they should have been freed. It was likely that this was concealed from Lizzie, but in spite of all of this, she was fiercely defensive of Agnes Flake. She called her the best woman that lived and said she loved her better than anyone in the world. When, following the Civil War, friends encouraged her to speak out against her former owner, Lizzie would steadfastly refuse, and instead defended Agnes with an intense loyalty usually reserved for the closest of family members. I have to ask myself when I read what she said, do I believe her words, or do I let the easy pull of paternalism overtake me, let the moral superiority of my 21st century hindsight wash over me and shake my head as I think this poor woman so brainwashed into thinking she was happy or that she liked Agnes Flake? Or do I trust the record and take it at face value? Do we trust her words? It's a difficult question. We could do violence to this woman all over again by dismissing her words, but it would also be naive to not acknowledge the circumstances of her life that might have tainted her own perception. At the very least, I wonder, did she know who she was? And I'd like to think she did. Lizzie married Charles Rowan, certainly by 1860, but probably earlier. That's the thing about writing and talking about people like her. Without records, there is no history, but unless you were a white male and owned some land, records will be scarce, if not non-existent. Fortunately, Lizzie and Charles became fairly prominent in San Bernardino. He was a barber for many years at a popular hotel. She was a laundress. Their daughter graduated from college in 1888, an astounding feat for an African-American woman some 14 years after the collapse of Reconstruction. The next name I'd like to talk about is Henry Widdle. Henry was a printer, though someone wrote down painter on the ship's manifest when he traveled to the United States. Perhaps he was both, but I suspect it was a mistake. He worked with Amasa in the Millennial Star office in Liverpool when Amasa was on his mission in England from 1860 to 1862. Henry had seen to the publishing of the church periodical for many, many years when Amasa arrived. When you pick up a copy of the Star, or is more likely to do today, when you peruse a digital scan online, it's in no short way thanks to Henry. By 1862, he had enough money to take his family across the sea to Zion. His wife, Annie, and his 3 children, Rosa, Walter, and Annie, ages 14, 10, and 7, went with him. He wrote that he was, quote, feeling to rejoice at the privilege of gathering with his family to the valleys of the mountains. They boarded the sailing ship William Tapscott, and after sermons and prayers, they departed on May 14, 1862. Lyman, Charles Rich, and George Buchanan had business in Washington, D.C., so they were able to make the crossing in under 2 weeks on the steamboat Kangaroo. But Henry and his family joined 802 other saints on the sailing ship, and the journey took nearly 6 weeks. The sea was harsh, the weather was merciless, few could keep their rations down. The vomit was so constant that the stench of it filled the nostrils of everyone on board. The travelers could seek fresh air above only momentarily before the weather or their own sickness forced them below deck again. At least one toddler died on the crossing. They sailed into New York on June 25th, 26 years before the Statue of Liberty would pop up to greet them. Instead, they sailed past what was called Bedloe's Island then, a military garrison, and they were deeply grateful to have their feet planted on solid ground. They boarded trains with the rest of the immigrants who were many of whom were taking trains for the very first time in their life. They made their way to Chicago. They sailed down the Mississippi to Florence, Nebraska, formerly winter quarters, the last stopping point before making the journey across the plains to Salt Lake City. I don't know why this story affects me and why I wanted to talk about Henry, but here's how his story ends. He was standing next to a wagon filled with his family's luggage when a storm quickly rolled into Florence. He was struck by lightning and killed instantly. Lyman wrote that he left a wife and 3 children to mourn his sudden demise and feel the loss, and I couldn't find out what happened to them afterwards. The last person I want to mention is a woman I've become completely enamored with, and a few people here have heard me speak of her before. Paulina Eliza Phelps Lyman. Are there any descendants here from her family? She was Amasa's 6th wife. They married just weeks before the abandonment of Nauvoo in the winter of 1846. I think she was 18. She is remembered, when she is remembered at all, which is almost never, for decades later, I think in 1903, she wrote a reminiscence of a blessing Joseph Smith gave her, she said, when she was a child. In the blessing, she was promised that she would travel to the Rocky Mountains, and this account became one of a handful that is used to argue that Joseph Smith had this prophecy and saw where the saints would settle, despite exploring possibilities in Texas, California, and Oregon. Since their marriage, Paulina lived a lonely life. She was, in effect, a single mother for most of her 31-year marriage. She did not travel with Amasa. She lived in Parowan while he traveled around the state and went to California. She did not go with him to Europe on his mission. None of the wives did, I believe. And when he finally settled down in Utah in the 1860s, he lived in Fillmore, and she remained in Parowan. He lived in Fillmore with his first wife and with the Partridge sisters. Their son Mason died at age 14 of an accidental gunshot wound. He was taking a rifle out of the back of a wagon and it discharged. Then in 1874, she suffered another loss. Since I read this many months ago, I have not stopped thinking about this letter. She penned it to her husband miles away from her in Fillmore. Their oldest son, Oscar, died in a boiler explosion. Her grief is acute, and it is made all the more painful by her loneliness and her reliance on Oscar as a surrogate father. Here's the letter. Dear Amasa, with a broken heart I sit down to write you what I can of our grief. Last Thursday, just at dark, Mrs. Halterman came to the back door and screamed the mill had blown up and all the men killed. I hoped but only to get to the front door when I met Brother Benson crying and said our Oscar was gone. You can gauge my feelings when I saw our boy scalded from head to foot. His right arm and shoulder all broke to pieces, his right leg tore nearly off just above the knee, and the calf of his leg hanging to the knee portion. The foot and ankle was picked up about a foot from his body. His clothing was all tore off him. The top of one shoe was on him. One part of his shirt and belt jumper was on him. His head was not broken. There was a cut under his left ear, the right side of his face. The skin was off where he was hit. His beard combed and a cloth laid out over his right eye and cheek. He looked natural and pleasant. I hardly know how I can write at all. His 4 children screamed and cried, and his wife Medora, poor girl, fainted every little while and refused to be comforted. And there I was. I had not you, nor Marion, nor Lorenzo, nor no father, no brother, no strong arm to lean on. And there lay my dear Oscar, who had watched like a husband or father over the family, had been the dutiful child and pride of his parents and loved by all who knew him. I could only pray for kind angels to comfort us in our grief, and sometimes I think it is poor comfort and still hardly know how I stand it as well as I do. We talk about polygamy a lot today, but I wonder if we don't talk about how hard it was for so many of these women enough. That was not the end of her story, though. After Amasa's death in 1877, she traveled to Salt Lake City. She studied obstetrics under Ellis Shipp, and she became a midwife and performed surgery and set broken bones. And she did this from her 50s well into her 80s. She never remarried. She traveled with her sisters to England and saw the sights. She had her photograph taken there with them. Her 2 sisters are seated, wearing dresses so plain and so black they'd vanish on a dark night. Paulina is standing behind them. She's also wearing a black dress, but with gold buttons, and there's this gold chain that comes down because she was carrying a pocket watch. She looked steady and sure. She was married to Amasa for 31 years. She was a widow for 35. And it's hard not to conclude that almost as if she was just yearning to be free, she made the most of those 35 years. She's the last of those names. These are the stories we glean from diaries like Amasa Lyman's. There are so many periphery tales, so many lives to discover. These people deserve to be remembered. and they deserve our attention. And I hope as you go through the diaries or any primary source that we can all pause just for a second when we read their names to give them just a moment of thought. Thanks.
This guy's had his hand up.
Oh.
Could I say a couple things about Lyman? She was his favorite wife. She has a statue in Parowan for being a great midwife.
Yeah,
She was the star medium during his spiritualist time.
right, yeah.
Someone wrote a play about her in the 1970s at BYU, and I cannot find it anywhere. I'd love to find it.
Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
I want to express my thanks to Benchmark and Signature for being in, having this opportunity to address you about this volume, and I'm really grateful for what John had to say, and wish that Scott were here and could really represent himself well. But we're not left abandoned. Leo made it up from St. George, so we're in pretty good shape here tonight. I am not a historian. I want to convey what this volume means to the family. I'm more inclined along those lines, and it won't have to take me very long. I did identify some passages that I thought were interesting, and maybe I'll read one of them if there's a moment. But I want to start by saying we are fortunate in the Lyman family to have historians. Besides Scott, who is now passed away, and Leo, who is here, we also have Lyman Platt, who is a Lyman descendant and is an excellent historian. And I'm sure there are many more that I'm not aware of. As a descendant myself of Amasa, my grandmother's grandfather was Amasa, and according to Leo, his nickname was Amasee. So maybe I'll start using that as I go forward here, that name. It's interesting to me what he means and doesn't mean to our family. So 6 generations down, you wouldn't really expect much, right? But here is a man who was baptized into the church in 1832 and held prominent relationships and positions in the church all through the early development of the church. And it seems like he would be somebody that you really learn a lot about from family. But growing up, as I did in Salt Lake, at family gatherings, we never talked about Amasa, we never talked about Francis Marion, and so it's been a point of curiosity to me to discover as an adult how that came about, why that was. Was it that we were embarrassed that he left the church and didn't want anybody to be influenced by that? Was it that he was just so far back that we were afraid all the kids would be bored if we started talking about him? Was it a sense of humility that we didn't want to get caught up in self-adulation as a family? I've been wondering that, and I don't really know the answer. The people who could have spoken about him a lot included Marion D. Hanks, who was my great uncle, who is evidently named for Francis Marion. That never occurred to me growing up. I didn't discover anything about Amasa Mason Lyman until my 20s, probably when I ran across the book by Albert R. Lyman. And Albert R. Lyman, a grandson of Amasa, really did a great job documenting in a romantic way the story of Amasa's role in the church. Now, I'd say then that from my family perspective, Amasa is more buried than normally would be expected. And so, also from my perspective, I'm excited as president of the Amasa Mason Lyman Educational and Historical Society to try to unbury him, to try to bring him out of the woods. This book, to me, represents another major step forward in doing that. It adds, if I may, to this marvelous volume that Leo wrote, what's it been, 10 years ago?
Yeah, and it's amazing you can lift.
It's a wonderful piece of history. It's an extension of what Albert R. Lyman wrote, leaves out the romantic part, and it gives you good solid history, and it confronts the issue that Amasa left the church, and he was disenfranchised and disenchanted, clearly disenchanted with the church, from 1870 till 1877 at least, and before 1870 as well. Well, what about that? What do I personally make of that? For me, as a family member, I'm far more interested in the part of the story that comes after his death. And it could be true or it could be false, but it's true as far as I'm concerned. Which goes like this. Daughter Martha Roper had a dream, and in the dream, Amasa appears to her. And having been buried in his old black suit and his old black boots, because they wouldn't bury him in temple clothes because he was excommunicated and he had been, he'd lost his priesthood authority, he came to her in his old black boots and suit and said, Martha, I am tired of this clothing. I want to get past this chasm that's between you and me, and there's only one way that that can be done, and it can only be done through Francis Marion. Now, Francis Marion was in the Quorum of the 12 at the time. I believe he was the president of the Quorum of the 12, or he was getting to be. And so he went to Joseph F. Smith, who had been instrumental in the excommunication of Amasa, and pled his case on the basis of a dream. And for a while it didn't take, but after several years, Joseph F. Smith finally approved that Francis Marion be baptized for him again and receive the temple ordinances again. Am I pretty close on that?
Yeah. Joseph F. was not in the investigation. He was the apostle who replaced Amasa.
Oh, thank you, that's right. Well, so, to me, Amasa got across the chasm and he got out of the old black suit. To me, he's dressed in white. To me, he's been redeemed. When my vice president and I took over the society in 2013, it just came on us like an inspiration that the theme for our society should be redemption. And not just redemption. Redemption, a labor of love. It's love for family that drives us in the society to try to reach out and share the story of Amasa, not just his baptism and his work as a missionary, not just his work as a mission president in the European mission, founding San Bernardino before that, living in Fillmore after that. Certainly not just his apostasy and his seances, his spiritualism, but his afterlife. That really moves me. Someday, my dream is that we'll have a pageant. And in this pageant, it'll be about redemption. It'll be for all men and women. And it'll be showing that final moment after a reflection on a life well lived. As I was thumbing through the chapters that include Amasa's diary after he apostatized and left the church, I noticed that he read a lot. I would call him an intellectual, perhaps a wayward intellectual. There are many comments in his journal, little tidbits here and there, that show extreme romanticism. Romanticism, I learned in college, reached its height in the 1830s, 1840s amongst the European and Eastern American intellectuals. And it could be characterized as beautiful music, as in Beethoven, and also as in very flowery speech, as in poetry. Amasa dabbled in poetry. As I was reading his journal from ages 58, 59, 60, he's a young man still by my standards, and I'm not very old, I admit, but you know, I'm pretty old. He was spending all day reading. He said, spent the day reading. And what did he read? He'd read history, he'd read magazines that he loved to receive from the East Coast. He'd read a lot about spiritualism, and that's part of why he was so enthused about spiritualism. This gives me one more touch point that I think I'll finish with. When I was a medical student at the University of Utah, I caught wind of a brand new book called Life After Death. Life After Life, sorry, Life After Life. And being in medicine, I was intrigued at the thought that there might be evidence that people who have passed away can remember what happened to them while they were gone after they've been resuscitated, say after a heart attack or something. 1/3 of people who've had heart attacks report memories of what happened while they were dead. So I read that book and I got fascinated, I got caught up, I'd say, not to an extreme, but to a degree of belief in the idea that that constituted decent evidence of the spirit. There is a spirit that has consciousness that extends beyond our mortal bodies. And of course, I grew up being Mormon, and I want to state clearly and solidly that I have a testimony of the gospel of Jesus Christ as restored through Joseph Smith and propagated by Brigham Young. Granted, he may have gotten a little old to people after 30 years in charge. He was being somewhat of a dictator at that stage. They couldn't see in 1870 what we can see now, that he was going to die and be replaced and then replaced and then replaced, and it wasn't going to be a dictatorship forever. So I can sympathize with Amasa for being a little frustrated with that. But more to the point, these people believe very firmly, because of visitation of angels, because of the Book of Mormon, the gospel being restored, they believe very firmly that our spirits continue on. And Amasa was all about truth and making your life perfect, which is what got him kicked out of the church, so that you can be with God in the next world. And when I say got him kicked out of the church, what I refer to is he argued in his Dundee speech that if we've been baptized and we've made covenants that we will obey the commandments, we better darn well obey them. And that's what saves us. And it's not the blood of Christ that saves us. And that just pushed it one step too far, and a few years later he got called on the carpet for that. And it was the combination of that and other factors that led to his excommunication, loss of personal relationships. Well, back to seances. Also, as I'm reading from this latter period, 1869, 1870, I guess, 71, he not only reads all day, but he goes to seance every night. Every night for a year, at least. I mean, they were very, very active. And what were they doing in their seances? Well, they were receiving visitations from people who had passed away, who to them, of course, and to us as well, were very real. And they would come, and through the services of a medium, would say a word or two. It wasn't very much. When it was Joseph Smith, it was a pat on the back. It was, Amasa, you're on the right track, being separated from the church, and eventually the church will realize that you're wrong. I mean, that they're wrong and that you're right. That sort of thing. And much more frequently it was family, loved ones, his father, his mother. Now, I spent 12 years of my early career back east. As was mentioned, I was teaching at Brown, and while I was teaching at Brown, I was living in Rehoboth first, waiting to marry my wife, Angel, my second wife, and also to moving to Swansea with her after. And while there, I had the chance to visit Amasa's mother's relatives, graves and homes and sites. Fascinating historical sites. I had a tour of a dozen places that I wanted to take all my family members to and explain to them about his loved ones, because I had fallen in love with Albert R. Lyman's book about him. And he was in love with these ancestors in the way that we love our families and our ancestors. And so he was visiting with them in these seances. So I asked myself, do I blame him? I mean, that became, because it was a movement of Eastern United States Christianity that was debunked and considered stupid eventually, and too much like believing in ghosts and superstition. When I grew up, I remember in 6th grade, not going up on the stage of the school and playing with the Ouija boards behind the curtains with the other kids, because I knew that was evil. My mom taught me that there was something wrong with that. But here I'm reading about Amasa doing it every night, and really, really enjoying the experience of visiting with his mother or his father or somebody who had passed away that he loved. Well, where I'm going with that is that, to conclude, I find a redemption myself in reading this book. I'm grateful for this book being out because it gives me touch points to my own life. I find myself relating to him in ways I never would have. It also reminds me to journal. And my mom's just compiling her papers right now, so she's going to be another Amasa Lyman book in due time. Everything's being recorded by my super pen right here, because this keeps track of what's being said and where it's being said and records everything you write, and it can be transferred to a computer. So I highly recommend this for those of you who always wished you could get around to journaling and haven't done it yet. This is a way to go. It's called LiveScribe. Anyway, I'm very grateful for the book. I'm very grateful to Signature Books for putting it out, and I thank you all for listening and giving me the chance to express my testimony and my love for Amasa M. Lyman. Thank you.
Hey, fire, it's your turn to fire away. I'll just, maybe you guys can just share. Designated caller on it.
Sure.
May I ask Brad to tell a little bit about how it went with the transcribing of the journals and so forth?
Yeah, you want to come up, Brad?
Sure.
You didn't get off the hook.
Oh, that's fine.
Well, my dad was an interesting individual. He's, just to give you a little background, when he had 5 kids, we lived in Oregon, and all his father and his father's fathers, all the way through to when Harvard used to be a school for ministers, had gone to Harvard. And so he grew up in a house with plates with Harvard on there. And so he'd always kind of had this thing of, I want to go to Harvard. And so he had 5 kids, and he kind of was in a dead-end job because it was a family-owned furnace company, and he was as high as he could go. And he applied, and they accepted him, so he went. And ever since that, since I was a kid, my dad always had a book in his hand. If we were watching TV, he'd be reading a book while he was watching TV. If we'd go to our baseball games, he'd be reading books while we were going, that photography. So as far as I know, we'd sit down at dinner, and where most kids, you'd have regular conversations. He would talk about the economy in Japan and different, history things, and very interesting individual. And in fact, he's got boxes and boxes and boxes of research that will probably never come to light. Maybe it will, who knows. That he's just kind of left behind at home because he was working on, this was just one of many, many projects that he put together. But he was very analytical and thought a lot. He wasn't a real fast thinker. He liked to slowly think through things. A good example is we had to put in cement in our house in California, and he had taken time and really analyzed and measured and drawn out a plan of the multiple sidewalks that they could plan around. And then he called his friends up and they said, hey, we'll come over and help you, his bishop and his counselor, who weren't quite as analytical as he was. And so he said, okay, I've spent time putting together this plan. I want you to go ahead and just look at this, and we can measure and get it all perfect. Well, they looked at the plan and they gave it back to him and went out and built the sidewalks just without measuring or anything. They just sort of cut wood and made but that's kind of how he was. And so as he did this book, he was very methodical. Nothing was rushed. In fact, he used to call me all the time because I worked at the church, and he'd say, now don't you get a chance to meet with the First Presidency? And I said, no, I don't. They have like these special journals of Amasa that's in the First Presidency's library, and they won't let me have them. Can you talk to someone? Do you know the Richard Turley, the head of, or the general authority that's at the time it was Elder Marlin Jensen. Can you talk to him? Can you go and see, can you get those special closed journals that they won't let me have? And I would say, oh, I'll see what I can do. And then I wouldn't go, obviously, to any of them and talk to them about those things. But he lived it. He very, very detail oriented. He loved to research. And he, if any of you have looked at those journals, if any of you do indexing, I always do the military records because they're typed. Because I tried doing like the handwritten ones and I would get frustrated after maybe the third name. Anyway, all the journals were like this. And so you'd have to get used to them. And they weren't written by him. Some were written by scribes who wrote kind of like him but different. But you had to just, it was very painstaking. It took a lot of time. And then you had to research all the different pieces and names and places. And as you'll see in the book, there's references to everything and everybody that's mentioned and who they are and what this means and how significant it was. But he was a very smart individual, and this is just the tip of the iceberg of things he had researched, and he thought about this, I think, for years and years that he had to do this. He felt really compelled that he needed to put this together. So, was that good? Yeah. Any questions?
Can I add to it, Brad?
Yeah.
I just want to add the footnotes, maybe 4 or 5 footnotes per page are amazing because the depth of knowledge that they represent, how he managed to gather so many facts together into the footnotes is astounding to me, and it's one thing that I really love about the volume. Plus, the other main thing that Scott seems to have done alone is fill out the names. Maybe they're obvious, but they wouldn't be obvious to me. So where there's a first name or there's just a last name, he's got the whole name everywhere. And to me, that also took an enormous amount of work. I don't know how he could have done this. It's just a lot of work. Very valuable to the reader. Becky.
So I'm interested in the seances. So, because I study this in anthropology a little bit, and I'm interested, I think you used the word visitations. Did I understand correctly that the people, you even said Joseph Smith, that they didn't appear visually, and then the voice went through the medium? Is that correct? Am I picturing that right?
Yeah, there's not that they appeared visually.
But they didn't hear their voices. The voices came through the medium.
The medium spoke.
And did the medium do anything to prepare himself that you know of?
It's not disclosed
It's not
that I can
disclosed?
see. It's just that it took some training.
Yeah.
Sometimes they would have seances that weren't very fruitful.
Yeah, that word seance is a little laden. And then last question is, do you know?
That's what they call them,
Yeah, well, yeah, nowadays that would be
Laden.
Yeah. So now, and last question, would the church then or now that you know of, any of you three, have a position on whether or not this thing was possible then or if it's possible now? It seems like now, my instinct is probably not, but does the church have a position then? Were other members of the church having seances and visitations?
I think Leo will comment for sure on whether it was acceptable to Brigham Young. What else, Leo?
Amasa started flirting with it when a spiritualist medium, an old mountain man named John Brown, healed Francis M. from brain fever. And Francis M. and both parents acknowledged that that had happened. Brigham knew that Amasa was flirting with it. There were probably 6 different brands of spiritualism in San Bernardino. It was a fad. But it was never an issue in him losing his priesthood or his apostle or his church membership. Brigham knew about that. That wasn't an issue.
Okay.
There were probably 8 different mediums, including several of his daughters and the first wife, as well as Pliny, who was the best one.
Another telling comment that comes out of the diaries is that they had guests coming from back east, not infrequently in the 1870s, who were supposedly experts in this spiritualism stuff, which Scott points out in a footnote clearly indicates what a powerful center of spiritualism was found here in Utah, that they would be able to attract high-profile speakers from back east on the new train. You know, a lot of times it was people that wanted to come out, no doubt, and see what the Mormons were like now that there was a train access to it. But they were giving speeches. Liberal Hall, I'm sure they had speeches on, is that fair to say, Leo?
Yes.
Speeches on spiritualism.
They were nationally prominent, but the Church of Zion, which the Godbeites had, it detracted from it. It was more popular before they started flirting with that. It detracted from the fellowship that was angry at Brigham for political and economic reasons, not spiritual. This did not help their movement. But they couldn't leave it alone.
Why do you say that? Was it that the Godbeites were against spiritualism themselves?
No. It became their religion.
It became the issue
But
instead
it
of the
wasn't
spiritualism.
at the beginning.
Yeah. Similar questions could be asked about polygamy, because the Godbeites were very antagonistic to polygamy, but Amasa, according to Leo's book, refused to cooperate with that side of the
It
Godbeites.
split it in two. It killed the Godbeite movement.
John?
Yes, what is the effect of the death of Mason on the adoption of spiritualism on Amazon?
I don't know.
Did that play a role?
Did Amasa's death lead to the death of spiritualism, or the
Mason's death.
Roswell Mason, the young man,
Roswell Mason?
the big 200-pound 15-year-old, Fairwood, Pliny's son.
Did that play a role?
No. It broke their heart because he was really promising.
Well, the spiritualism was going on long after he died, wasn't it?
Yes, and it had probably started before he died. It
Yeah.
started in San Bernardino when he was a baby.
On the issue of Brigham Young and spiritualism and the Godbeites, there's a line in the diary where Brigham said, just ignore these people. And there's a line from, and I'm going to forget which one, I don't think it was Lorenzo, I think it was another son. If you remember, Leo, tell me. But two of Amos's sons moved to California, and one of them says something, I want to move to a place where a man is treated decently, based like a man, because he just felt so ignored because of his participation in spiritualism. And it split the family. You have Francis Marion, who had nothing to do with this, but then you have Lilia, who was a medium most of the time, and other children that were mediums. And sometimes the mediums wouldn't speak, they would knock. So they would come and say, can you speak? And they would knock twice for no. And do that kind of thing. It's fast. So I will say really quickly, it's fascinating to me to listen because I'm not Mormon and I'm not a family member. And when you come at Amasa Lyman from that perspective, he's the coolest guy in the world. You know, like it wouldn't even dawn on me that maybe it's difficult or painful or whatever for family members. Oh, he was excommunicated and all. The spiritualism is so fascinating. He was a fascinating person and I found him working on the diary to be extremely likable. And a good, you read about the way he talks about poor people in Europe, and it's very moving. He cares deeply for these people, and he just seems, you know, like a good person who was hurt by Brigham Young's rejection. It's difficult for me not to conclude that Brigham Young was not very nice to him. So.
Is that it?
I think we're good.
Okay.
Any more comments?